A mixed bunch, some good players, some not so good, some good types of players, you know, as individuals, and some not so good types. And obviously the problem was to sort them out.
What was the first thing you did?
Sorted them out.
It's 1957, Norwich have finished bottom of the professional English game. Within 5 years they'd gotten their first trophy. It was all part of the long and wild road that the club had to drive down in order to get to the top of English football, which would finally be realised in 1972. This is that story. Quick history on Norwich City, you ready? Let's go. 1902, Robert Webster and Joseph Cooper Nucci smash out a beginning of a Norwich City on White Lion Street in the centre of town. After agreeing on an annual rent of 25 quid for land on Newmarket Road, the club was at the races. 6 years later the club moves to the Nest, where they are officially first called the Canaries. It is in this time where they adopt the yellow and green motif. Having gained acceptance into the Southern League 3 years prior, Norwich's biggest game comes in January 08 with a cup win over the holders Wednesday in front of over 10,000 supporters. Unfortunately, silverware would be a stranger to the club for quite some time yet. The Great War spurs on a financial difficulty for all clubs, and Norwich no exception, as they were wound up in 1917 and had to reapply for the Southern League in time for the restart in 1919. Within a year they'd be in the 3rd Division, later rearranged to the 3rd Division South. Manager Jim Kerr had been slowly building towards making something out of the club in the early 30s, but sadly he wasn't around to see the club's ascension to the 2nd Division in 1934, having sadly previously died 14 months ago. In this time they found what middle-aged mums call their forever home when Carrow Road was built in 1935. It was inaugurated with a typically exciting 4-3 triumph over West Ham in front of 30,000 souls in August. By the time of the Great War sequel, officially known by the abbreviation WW2, Norwich were back in English football's basement after suffering relegation in 1939 by 0.05 of a goal thanks to goal average. The Canaries always had a bit of a cup shock in them, none more so than ejecting champions Arsenal in 1954. Sadly, the club would follow up its most famous victory yet by chucking in a home defeat against Leicester City in the very next round. The 3rd Division South would be the club's resting place for all of the 50s. This included an embarrassing slump to bottom place in 1957. But they rebounded thanks in part to the help of Arthur South, more on him later. They simply had to. With the restructuring of English football, Norwich had to go from 24th to 12th in a single season to avoid being plopped into the new 4th Division. Key signings Terry Alcock and Barry Butler were made, and the club not only avoided a harsh relegation, but used it as a springboard into the 60s. Archie Macaulay was the manager who picked the Canaries up at its lowest and rehabilitated it so it could flap its wings. First came the great cup run of 59, which included another mesmeric shock for the ages when Matt Busby's Manchester United were thrashed 3-0 in the 3rd round. Not only that, after sinking Cardiff in the 4th, they had the chance to go further than they had ever done before. And what's more, we've got footage.
How the Tottenham goal stayed intact as Norwich piled on the pressure, not even they themselves knew. At last the ball went to Terry Bly. It was in the net like a flash. After 13 minutes, Errol Crossan sent the ball to Bobby Brennan. He deceived right back Caldwell and put Norwich 1-up.
Norwich were now handed a golden opportunity to play at Wembley Stadium. In a field containing Nottingham Forest and Aston Villa, Luton Town and White Hart Lane was pulled from the hat.
Bingham scores.
It was the first case of Norwich City coming so close yet being so far away from a major trophy. Thankfully, a stunning promotion campaign to the 2nd tier would cushion the blow, as would the hindsight of another 3rd tier season being over half a century away. Promotion was confirmed on the penultimate day with a 4-3 seesaw battle with Southend United, and despite the departure of the free-scoring Terry Bly, it proved they could hang in the new division, almost gaining entry right through to the top flight at the very first time of asking when they finished 4th. This in spite of losing Terry Alcock's goals too after he went down with a broken leg in September. The next season, however, would be a golden one for the Canaries. Again, it was a campaign that started off being fraught with danger as Archie Macaulay upped and left for West Brom. His replacement, Willie Reid, came in from St Mirren and delivered a first ever glory to Norwich. The League Cup was still in its infancy, but Norwich still had a difficult task in reaching the competition's second ever final through the historic names of Middlesbrough, Sunderland and Blackpool. What they found in the final was a team even lower down in the football pyramid than they were, Rochdale, therefore a real chance to win what would become a major trophy. The tie was effectively won at Spotland with a 3-0 first leg hammering. The formalities were completed, however, at Carrow Road through Jimmy Hill, that one's winner. It should have been the building blocks for something special. Then Willie Reid chipped back up to his North homeland. His successor George Swindon didn't even last the year, and whilst club legend Ron Ashman and Lol Morgan stabilised the club in Division 2, it was all a bit comfy. They had yet to replicate their promotion push from the first season, and you could forget about trophies in this time as well. The closest they got to any type of silverware were the League Cup quarter-final exits immediately after they had won the thing, as well as a limp FA Cup exit at the same stage at home to eventual finalist Leicester City in '63. No, Norwich were running the risk of bringing their stale football into the 1970s. Then everything spun on the signing of a new manager in the summer of 1969. Lol Morgan was leaving behind a squad that he only was just starting to cultivate. David Stringer had become one of his regulars at the heart of defence, and Duncan Forbes was also there. Together, they'd play over 750 times for the Canaries. The man who would pick up their careers next was a certain Ron Saunders, a prolific lower league forward in his playing days. He came to Carrow Road with not a whole lot of managerial experience, to be honest. In the absence of money, the new manager's disciplinarian attitude would have to mould new players out of the ones at his disposal. His first dips into the transfer market, though, would be crucial. Peter Sylvester coming from Reading and Coventry's Graham Padden for a combined 45k. There was very little improvement seen to the team in his first full campaign. The material total was 3 more points and 2 places higher as they once again went nowhere in the cups and were ultimately saved by a 12-match unbeaten end to the season. It was clear things weren't going to plan just yet.
Ford who's free there. Oh, it's there! Here goes McCallion. Beautifully taken. Warboy's coming in on it. Off Keelan to Clark, he must score.
12 points was the distance Norwich had to make up between themselves and the 3 automatic places. There had been yet more minor improvements all the way across the board, from attacking to defensive numbers. In the midfield, Doug Livermore had been a decent acquisition from Liverpool. Right from the off, it was apparent that the 1971-72 campaign was a bit different. The players felt fresher, the managers' ideas were flowing into them easier, and after a healthy pre-season in Portugal, they hit the ground running.
City came from behind to win 3-2. 1 goal for Trevor Howard.
Again the long one. Forbes coming to it. Forbes returning again. Oh, and it's a good shot.
Norwich were never going to be anything but steady under Saunders, capping off their unbeaten start to the season by finally going top of the table with a win over Oxford at Carrow Road in September. The campaign had started with a draw at Luton, and by the time the Hatters came back to their place in mid-October, Norwich still had yet to lose. Another 3-1 win kept a safe 5-point lead over third place. Although the unbeaten streak fell a week later to the only side not to lose a game in the league, that being Millwall, the Canaries were still on their perch at the top of the table, and they simply shrugged off that minor setback going into Christmas. That was despite losing captain Duncan Forbes to a hamstring injury for 4 months.
Of Charlton brought 2 goals for Kenny Fogger, the first, another of his flying headers.
Norwich players were dropping like flies. Sylvester's cartilage injury in late January against Preston robbed him of the remainder of the campaign. Regardless, the Canaries remained in the hunt despite not winning for 6 games immediately afterwards. A still healthy enough 3-point gap was still opened up to third, and Norwich now had a game in hand to use up on Millwall in order to return to the top division. Fate still in their hands, the Canaries continued to soar.
On March the 15th, Hull City were back at Carrow Road 2 months to the day after they'd been here and knocked the Canaries out of the FA Cup. Put on Graham Palace.
No trouble.
The difference maker was Jimmy Bowen, signed from Partick Thistle, and he was a man who was adding depth to a front line which had been overly reliant on David Cross's contributions. A stunning 5-1 win over Blackpool turned the tide, and an unbeaten Easter kept Norwich top of the league with 5 games to play.
Bowen is on the goal line. It's a goal. That player's going over to the far post again, racing away. And it's a goal.
At times in any successful season, you need your key players to stand up and be counted. It's almost a line you can hear Roy Keane saying in your mind, isn't it? Well, this Norwich equivalent in 1971-72 was Duncan Forbes. It was him with the captain's headers, his first goals of the season in 1-0 wins over Sheff Wednesday and Swindon Town in April. Given numerous challenges games in hand, a useful barometer continued to be the Canaries' 3-point advantage over Millwall. Next it was down to the capital, Norwich needing a win over Orient to confirm promotion.
Also went to Brisbane Road that Monday night, hoping to witness history in the making. Kenny Foggo put City on their way with the first goal.
Norwich had waited nigh on 70 years to grace the top flight of English football, and now that they were here, what were they capable of? It was certainly the happiest of starts, as they got a point from recent champions Everton on the opening afternoon before gaining local bragging rights over Ipswich Town in their first top division win. Of course, this was never always going to be this successful, but the opening half of the season did generate solid wins over superb teams. 1-0 against reigning champions Derby in August, a 3-2 triumph over recent double winners Arsenal in September, and a 2-1 victory over UEFA Cup holders Spurs, just to name a few. It really was a golden age.
Two men in the middle, Davis going in, and it's come out to Lee, and he's poked it in!
Stringer coming at the back of the run. Cross!
But all good things must come to an end, and with a 2-0 win over West Brom, the Canaries embarked on a simply disastrous run of league form, right the way from mid-November to after Easter, utterly winless and producing just 5 points from 19 games of football. It was a run of form that had seen Norwich discovered riding cloud 9, plucked from their heavenly mood and sent to the depths of hell known as a relegation scrap and bottom of the division. However, it wasn't all that bad, as the league disasters had only been so because of a little distraction called the League Cup. Now, I used the word historical carefully when I assessed Norwich's opposition in the run to their 1962 League Cup trophy. Whilst that campaign was an exercise in banishing old forgotten relics of the game out of a tournament, 11 years on, the Canaries were met with pure predators in the latter stages of the competition. Gone were the days where clubs were allowed to boycott the League Cup. Once Leicester, Hull and Stockport were ejected, the real business began in the quarter-finals, not coincidentally 3 days after Norwich's last league win for a while. They were due at Highbury to meet Arsenal, with a potential 2-leg semi-final against Chelsea. These weren't the past, they were the current, and Norwich had eliminated them both, not conceding a goal over 3 matches and scoring 5 themselves. They'd be posted to Wembley, where the opposition did not relent one bit.
And again, Mike England's going forward. Again, a lower one. Chivers with the back heel. Now Mike England hoping to get in. Coates hoping to blast it in. And Coates has done it.
It was the club's first ever match at Wembley, and sadly a first ever cup final that ended in defeat for Norwich. They had now 12 matches to salvage a goal average deficit to survive in the first division. By the time the Canaries started to sing again in league contest, in successive games won 1-0 against Chelsea and WBA, they had just about clawed out of the drop zone, which thankfully the bottom two for the last time in a long while. Their game in hand was next, a trip to Wolves, a team who had graced the UEFA Cup final the previous season, i.e. they weren't mugs, and showed as much when they slapped the Canaries about a bit 3-0. Norwich were never comfortable, their goal average significantly worse than relegation rivals Crystal Palace and West Brom. Thankfully it was Palace next at Carrow Road, and the goals of Colin Suggett and Dave Stringer had saved Norwich's skin. But this was a Norwich team living on the edge. It was a team that had failed to make inroads into the transfer market that summer and was more than willing to sell players like Graham Paddon, Jimmy Bone and Ken Foggo, who looked like three stages of the same man. The club was at an important crossroads. Were they going to sink just as quickly as they emerged, or were they going to put up a fight?
Best and Robson on the far post. In goes Best. Yes!
Knocked down by Stringer, straight to Lee. Good shots, yes!
The dominoes, they were quick to fall. Before the start of the season, Jazzy Jeff Watling resigned, paving the way for Arthur South to ascend to chairman. Unfortunately, things were just as transient on the pitch as the Canaries struggled to 2 wins from their opening 16 league encounters. It culminated in the Ron Saunders resignation after their 8th loss of the season at home to Everton. John Bond represented travel in a complete opposite direction, from the discipline to the flamboyance. And yet, he couldn't manufacture a climb up the table either. 1 week after their League Cup flame was snuffed out at the semi-final stage against Wolves, Norwich got 2 points on the board for the first time in 4 months in the league, winning at QPR before scraping past Sheffield United. The gap was already too prohibitive to close, what with 2 points for a win and now 3 teams being subjected to relegation. After the second of those aforementioned wins, the Canaries had 5 points to make up on West Ham, but they were above Manchester United, and Norwich supporters would have taken that all day long at the start of the campaign. But good results came in batches, from 5 unbeaten in March to 3 unbeaten in April. Nonetheless, City were relegated, with enough fight shown in them to give John Bond a piece of optimism going forward.
Sullivan still going. And Powell, a difficult one for him. Powell, yes!
It was an idyllic way to start life back in the second tier, as the Canaries were handed a difficult opening but passed most tasks with flying colours. 3 points taken off Southampton, a point gleaned at Villa Park before a disappointing hammering at Craven Cottage in September was rebounded perfectly well with a 2-0 win over fellow relegated club Manchester United. Tony Powell and Ted McDougall, who had worked wonders for John Bond down at Bournemouth, had been acquired, and it was the latter who scored a brace in that game, and it was the beginning of a long winning run in the league as the Canaries set their stall out. Come December, there was their very real distraction again, known as the League Cup, especially given the opposition that Norwich were handed, local rivals Ipswich Town. Whilst they were going about their business under Bobby Robson, Norwich punched from underneath, knocking them out after a replay. Now, with no top-tier teams left in the League Cup, there was every chance that Norwich were not only up for the Cup, but one of its favourites. Then again, the other 2 second-tier teams were Villa and Manchester United. It would be the latter Norwich would have to eliminate if they were to carry on in the competition.
Up goes Suggett. Suggett again.
Bolton takes another corner. Keelan's gone for this one. Oh, his handball! It's a penalty! Can Kevin Keelan stop it? Yes, he can, but he's got a chance for a second one goal!
Another Wembley final, another League Cup final, and yet again it was lost. Whilst it was an Aston Villa team they were defeated by, it would have irked Norwich that they had been beaten to the trophy not only by Ron Saunders, but by a team beneath them in the second division. The gap was now just a point with 11 to play, and Villa had a game's advantage on them. Now was the time to shake off that disappointment and go again. That was helped in no small part thanks to the bargain 50 grand transfer of Martin Peters from West Ham. Whilst Fulham again attempted to derail Norwich, a point at Old Trafford and crucial Carrow Road wins over Orient, Forest and Hull had the Canaries in a superb position on April 26th. It was officially the final day of the campaign, whilst League Cup finalists Norwich and second place Villa would meet at Carrow Road 4 days later to close the season down. Given the calibre of opposition still to come, Norwich were in a perilous state when they travelled to Portsmouth.
In for Boyer, but handed well. Now Maguire coming in, and what a good goal from Mick Maguire! For Suggett, the first time cross, McDougall, and Martin Peters has made a good run. There's Peters' header, and that is vintage Martin Peters. Released beautifully by Suggett. Now Phil Boyer. Phil Boyer against Phil Piggins. There's the shot. There's the third goal.
The required win was achieved, but it was never going to be by a healthy enough margin not to require favours from elsewhere. Luckily, Aston Villa partly repaid Norwich for breaking their hearts at Wembley by helping them above Sunderland with a win at home to the Rokerites. Norwich had gone up at the first attempt, they developed quite the knack for that. Now, the job was to stay there.
Peter's absolutely free, and that's true. Over this side, we've got Jones as well. Peter's shot. Oh, straight in the back of the net. 3 points for Rangers for the one ball. McDougall, it's there.
Money was spent more so on structural improvements to Carrow Road and to the training base. Nonetheless, it was a campaign in which Norwich recorded a dazzling 16 victories to finish in 10th, a club record. The subsequent 1976-77 campaign was one spent largely looking over their shoulder, out of the cups early, without much consistency in the league. They regressed 5 points and 6 places, probably thanks largely due to the sales of Ted McDougall and Dave Stringer. Of course, the goals of Viv Busby would cushion the blow, as would the signatures of Kevin Reeves and Jimmy Neighbour. Injuries would not only be a factor in this campaign, but beyond, as Graham Padden returned only to break his leg, but in the similarly dour but a bit more comfortable 77-78 campaign, when goalkeeper Kevin Keelan missed swaves with a broken hand. John Bond's team had come accustomed to just being good enough, drawing 18 of their 42 league matches, before bettering that with an astonishing 23 ties the campaign after. Thankfully, we still lived in a world of 2 points for a win, and Norwich's 7 victories was enough for a comfortable 16th place. Whilst Martin Shiver's high-profile signing had been a damp squib, Carrow Road would soon become enamoured with the graduation of youngster Justin Fashanu. It filled the gap after Kevin Reeves was sold for £1 million to Manchester City. As the 70s passed out into the 80s, Norwich continued to hover around the 40-point mark, with pulses only momentarily quickening for a potential run in the League Cup. However, Liverpool stopped them at the quarter-final stage. Things had got stale. The summer of 1980 meant more bright players departing. In Martin Peters' place was more experience in the form of 31-year-old Joe Royle. In fact, he was the only acquisition that summer. So when the Canaries were shot down at the start of the season, Bond went scurrying for the chequebook, smashing 300 grand down on Hajduk Split's Drazen Muzinic, a club record.
Johnston up, but Armstrong's in there, saved by the goalkeeper's feet, back by McAndrew, and in! Oh, and Hansberg's missed it, Jankovic! Oh, what a mix-up, and it's gone in! Hodgson's flick, oh, and it's gone in off Woods, I think. Johnson's at the far post, and Can Jankovic do it here? He can! Thumped it in!
Safe to say it didn't help, not immediately anyway. A week later, John Bond didn't even take to the dugout for the home tie against Wolves because he had been approached by Manchester City for their vacant manager's post. Right, that's our first Norwich video in the can. 3 more to come this week, part of a wider tour of Britain, which you can catch up on with the playlist here.